In this section, we'll be discussing Vray materials. It's going to be a very long section, but hopefully a lot more fun compared to our GI and image sampling discussions. In the first few lessons of this section, we'll be discussing the most important and used material in Vray, which is called Vray material or Vray MTL. So let's open up our material editor. In the material browser section, if you come down under materials, you can see a specific section for all the materials that Vray has to offer. In this lesson, we are interested in Vray MTL or Vray material. So let's drag it to the active view. Let me just zoom in and adjust the window a bit. Vray MTL or Vray material is the most powerful and versatile Vray material capable of producing almost all types of real-world shaders and materials from water to plastic, glass, wood, concrete, and much more. So let's double-click on its name so we can see its parameters in the parameter editor. Also, let me double-click on the material preview so we can see a bigger preview. First, let's apply the material to our shader ball. Select the shader ball in the scene, right-click on the material's name, and assign it to the selection. The first parameter that we have is the diffuse color. This is the base color of your material. You can choose a simple color or use a map. So let's run the active shade and see how diffuse color works in real time. In the render settings, change the production mode to active shade and start rendering the scene. So I can choose any color as the diffuse color and this way control the very base color of the material. Or if you click on this button, you can choose a map as your diffuse color. So let's click on this button and you can use Max's procedural maps or use any other bitmap. In this case, let's select bitmap from the general category and choose wood parquet V02 as our map. And as you can see, it appears on our object as our diffuse color. Let's for now use maybe a greenish color here as the diffuse color. Also in the active view, you can see now a bitmap node containing our wood texture has been connected to the diffuse map. Another interesting thing that you can do is to mix and match between your diffuse color and your diffuse map. Right now we have this green color as the diffuse color and this wood texture as the diffuse map. If you come down to the maps rollout of the material, you can see for diffuse we have a map defined, but we also have a number which says 100, and this is the magic number to be used if you wish to mix between your diffuse map and your diffuse color. Right now it's set to 100%, so only the texture will be used. If I set this number to 0, only the color will be used, and if set to 50% of the texture and 50% of the color will be used. Let's set it to 100 again. Now get back to the basic parameters and let me delete the map for the time being. You can simply right-click on the map slot and choose clear, or simply select a node in the view and press delete on your keyboard. Next we have roughness, which can be used to simulate dusty and flat surfaces. As I increase the roughness value, you can see how the surface gets rougher and appears to be a bit more dusty. Obviously, we can use a map to control the roughness amount. So let's click on the map slot, and this time let's select a procedural checker map. Now double click on the checker and let's increase its tiling to 10 and 10. you can clearly see how the texture or map affects the roughness. Where the map is black, we get 0 roughness, and when it is white, we get the maximum value of roughness, which is 1. Now let's delete the checker map and zero out the roughness amount. After the diffuse parameter, we have our reflection parameters. Obviously here you can define how reflective you want your material to be. As you can see, by default, Vray material has no reflection. We only see the diffuse portion of our material. Reflection color controls how reflective your material is and also the color of the reflections. By default, it's set to black, and that means no reflection. And as I brighten the color, we start to see reflections, obviously. As we get closer to white, we increase the reflectivity of our material, and when set to pure white, the material is the most reflective. As a rule of thumb, it's a good idea to avoid using pure white colors. Even if your material is very reflective, using a color value of something like 245, 250, so a bit of white will do the trick and wouldn't cause any potential problem in your render. So let's make sure the color value for our reflection is 245, or you can make it less reflective if you want. Obviously, you can use a map to control the reflectivity of your material. Where the map is black, you see no reflection, and if it's white, you start to see a reflection on your object. In this case, let's use a bitmap and use maybe BW21 as our reflection map. As you can see in the active shade, now the reflection amount is based on this map. Also, if you come down to the map section of your material, like the diffuse, you can use this number to mix between the reflection color and the reflection map. Let's delete the map for now. In order to see the rest of the reflection parameters better, let's set a very dark color as our diffuse. Normally reflections are much more visible on dark surfaces, so let's use a saturation value of 0, and the value can be something like 1. Next we have reflection glossiness, which controls how sharp or blurry the reflection is. By default it's set to 1, so the reflections are very sharp, and as you decrease this value, you can see the reflections are becoming blurrier or glossier. As with other parameters, you can control reflection glossiness with a black and white map. Where white pixels going to cause sharp reflections and darker pixels are going to cause blurrier reflections. So let's again use a bitmap, and this time load BW3 as the map. As you can see, where the map is white, we see sharp reflections, and where it's darker, the reflections are blurrier. Down here in the map section, you can mix and match between the defined texture for reflection glossiness and the value of the reflection glossiness. At 100%, we are using only the texture, and at 0%, the map is ignored and only the defined value, which is 0.7, is used, and at 50 we are using both the map and the value. Obviously you can use any other value between 0 and 100. For example, if I set it to 10, only 10% of the map and 90% of the color will be used in that case. Now let's set it back to 100. Let's go up here and set the reflection glossiness back to 1 and delete the map here. The next important parameter is Fresnel reflection, and as you can see, it's enabled by default. What is Fresnel? Fresnel states that the strength of reflections on a surface is dependent on the viewing angle. If you look at a surface straight ahead in a parallel fashion, the reflections will appear a lot weaker, and as the surface becomes more perpendicular to your viewing direction, the reflections are going to become much stronger. Think about a swimming pool. If you look at it at an angle, you can see the water is very reflective and it's hard to see the bottom of the pool. But if you look at it from above, the water is becoming less reflective and you can simply see the bottom of the pool. And that is basically Fresnel, and it's everywhere. It's such a universal phenomenon. So this is what Fresnel reflection is doing, and Fresnel IOR is what controls how strong the Fresnel effect is. By default, it's grayed out and locked to the IR value down here. If you want, you can simply unlock it by clicking on this L or lock button. My suggestion is do not unlock it and simply use the IR value from the refraction section down here. So let me lock it back to the IR value from the refraction section and see how it affects our material. Let's set the IR value to 1.1. As you increase the IR value, you are actually making the Fresnel effect less effective and powerful. So low values like 1.1 are going to show a very strong Fresnel effect, and increased values like, for example, 20, 25, 30, 35 are going to decrease the Fresnel effect. Also, let's right click on the material preview and enable show background in the preview so we can see the reflection a bit better. As you can see from the active shade and the material preview, the frontal or parallel angles are less reflective compared to edges or more perpendicular angles. You can clearly notice how more reflective the edges are, and as we increase the IOR value, we are basically making the reflection to be more even from different viewing angles. So let's go from 1.1 to 1.6. And I want you to focus both on the active shade and the material preview. Now, as you can see, the Fresnel effect is less visible and the reflections are more even on the surface. Let's go to something like 3 maybe. And now the Fresnel effect is even weaker. And the overall reflection seems stronger. If you keep increasing this number, you will notice that at something like 25, we have almost a chrome-like material. And now the Fresnel effect is so weak that it is almost invisible. One interesting thing is, in almost all the materials in real world, the reflections at the very edges of the surface to the viewing direction are almost mirror-like, even though it's very hard to notice those very reflective edges. So as we increase the Fresnel IOR value, we are making the reflection at frontal or parallel angles more even to the reflections at the edges or perpendicular angles to the viewing direction. That's why at a high value like 25, we can see this mirror or chrome-like surface. Basically, the frontal reflections now are almost as strong as the reflections at the perpendicular angles. The IR value is normally from 1 and then it goes up. For most household glasses, it's something like 1.5. For plastic, it's something like 1.4, 1.45. For materials like wood concrete, it can be from 3 to 6. You can search for Fresnel IOR values on the web, and if you are trying to make a realistic material, it's a good idea to search for the IOR for that material and put it here as the Fresnel IOR value or the refraction IOR. Let's set the IOR back to its default value of 1.6. The next parameter is highlight glassiness, and this controls the shape of the highlights, and it is locked to the reflection glossiness value by default to produce physically accurate results. You should never unlock this parameter and change it on its own, but to demonstrate how it works, let's unlock it. As you can see right now, because reflection glossiness is set to 1, we get reflections but no highlights. If I decrease the highlight glossiness, let's set to this, maybe 2.8 for example, we start to introduce these highlights around our sharp reflections, and if I keep decreasing it, the highlight is gonna even spread more around the reflections. Now let's set it back to 1 and lock it back to our reflection glossiness. Next we have subdivs, which controls the quality of the blurred or glossy reflections, and because we have our use local subdivs turned off in the global DMC controls, it's grayed out here. Obviously, if you have use local subdivs turned on, increasing the subdiv parameter should result in a more noise-free glossy reflections and increased render time obviously. Max depth is the number of times array can be reflected, and exit color is the color that will be returned if array has reached the max depth or the maximum reflection depth. Let me change the exit color to a bright red color, maybe 255 for red, 2 for green, and 14 for blue. Let's take a look at the frame buffer history and watch a few renders with different max depth numbers. In the first render, max depth is set to 1, and because the maximum reflection depth is so low and the inner reflections between surfaces is so limited, we can clearly see the exit color all over the place. If you zoom in and take a look at the reflection of the sphere in the base, or the reflection of the base object in the sphere, because the max depth is set to 1 and these surfaces cannot see each other, they simply reflect red, which is our defined max depth color. In the next render, max depth was set to 2 and we have gotten rid of those red reflections. But still, there are some red reflections, and that means we need to increase our max depth again. When max depth was set to 3, we almost done with any max depth issues, but we can see some redness here and there. And finally, max depth was set to 5, and as you can see, we have no max depth issues and the reflections are accurate for most cases. Max depth of 5 is normally enough for most scenes, but if you had tons of reflective surfaces in your scene, you might need to increase the max depth number, which in turn can lead to increased render time. Let's set the exit color back to black and press OK. Next we have dim distance and dim falloff. Dim distance specifies the distance from the camera after which there would be no reflection, or the reflection rays won't be traced after that distance, and dim falloff is the falloff radius for the dim distance. Let's make sure active shade is running, and also let's enable dim distance. The shader ball is almost 74 centimeters away from the camera. Let's set the dim distance to 0. As you can see, there is no reflection on our shader ball anymore. Let's go to 10. Now we start to get some reflections. 20, 40, and 60. And you can see the effect clearly. Now, the range for dim falloff is from 0 to 1, and as we increase the value towards 1, the transition between non-reflective and reflective parts is basically becoming more gradual. Now let's set the dim falloff to 0 and dim distance to 100, and let's disable it. Next we have effect channels, and it lets you specify which channel will be affected by the reflections. If you set the parameter to color only, the reflection will only affect the RGB channel of the final render, and we can see that in the active shade. As you can see, reflections does not affect the alpha channels in this case, but if set to color plus alpha, now the reflection, as you can see in the active shade, will affect both the RGB and the alpha channel. And if set to all channels, the reflections of the material will affect all the eligible render elements. Now let's select the effect channels to color only. Next, we're going to be discussing the Brdf rollout, which determines the type of the highlights and glossy reflections, and also the shape of the highlights. Let's set our reflection glossiness to 0.8 and IOR value to 25 so we can discuss the Brdf rollout. In the Brdf rollout, the first thing you have is the Brdf type, which includes Fung, Blend, Ward, and Microfacet GTR or GGX. These are basically reflection and highlight models, and we can take a look at a few renders with different Brdf types and see how each one changes the look after reflections. In the frame buffer, the first render is using Fung model. The second one is Blend, and the third one is Ward, and the last one is GGX. It's really not about which one looks better or worse, it's about which model represents the real world better, and in that case GGX is the one to look for. You can see in the Fung render the reflections and highlights are pretty tight. In the Blend version they get more spread, and in the Ward version they are even more spread. Before introducing GGX model into Vray, we used to use Blend model for plastic-like surfaces and Ward for metals. But right now GGX is the one I personally tend to use it for almost everything. And the reason being is that GGX is more realistic and gives us this beautiful multi-layered highlights. You see we have these centric sharper speculars and a more blurry layer underneath it, which is not visible in something like Fung or Blend. And most of the surfaces in real world actually show this behavior of GGX model. So it's a good idea to set the Brdf type to GGX for almost everything. For Fung, Blend, and Ward, we have this soften parameter, and what it does, it tries to soften the edges of the Brdf at light shadow transitions. It's not such an important option, and you can leave it alone. But for GGX, we have a specific parameter called GTR tail fall off, and it basically controls how much the highlights or more blurry part of the GGX model can spread. By default it's set to 2, and we can watch the render in the frame buffer. If I go to something like 3, you can see the highlights are getting tighter, but as I go lower than 2, you can see they are more spread, and at 1 and 0.5 the spread is more obvious. Now let's make sure GTR tail fall off is set to 2. Also, we have these fixed dark glossy edges. Enabling this option will fix dark edges that sometimes appear on objects with glossy materials. On the right side, we have some parameters to control an anisotropy effect. By default, your reflections are isotropic. You can use the anisotropy value to introduce some anisotropy or stretched highlights basically to your reflections. Let's run the active shade. Now let's increase the anisotropy value to something like 0.7. And as you can see now, we get some stretched reflections in a certain direction. Now let's use a negative value like negative 0.7, and now the reflections are stretched in another way or direction. Maybe we can use a value like 0.8. Next, we have rotation, which controls the orientation of the anisotropy effect. So if I set it to something like 90, you can see we have rotated our highlights by 90 degrees. Let's set the rotation back to 0. We have UV vector derivation, which lets you use the method to orient the anisotropic effect. By default, it's on z-axis. You can use a map channel if you want, or use other local axes of the object. Let's maybe try X. And Y. Okay, there you have it. Now, the most obvious use for the anisotropic effect is to simulate brushed surfaces, if you are wondering why you would want to have stretched highlights. You can achieve some interesting results if you use maps to control anisotropy or anisotropy rotation values. In this case, let's use a map for anisotropy rotation. Let's use this anisotropy 0,1 map. Let me first check how it looks on the object. I think we need to increase tiling to something like 5 maybe. And also let's set the reflection glossiness value to 0.7 to make the effect more interesting. Now let's see what we are gonna get in the active shade. Now let me stop the active shade and show you the final render. So that's what we have, and as you can see, it's very nice. And you can work more on the material and make it even more interesting if you want to. In this lesson, we learned about the diffuse, reflection, and Brdf options of our Vray material. In the next lesson, we discover refraction. See you there.